Hello everybody, today we are going to do a red rosebud. As you can see, I have already got it drawn up on my piece of paper, and you will notice that it is drawn up in colour. Now I've not actually worked in colour. What I've done is I've sketched it up in graphite on a piece of tracing paper. I have transferred it onto this paper, which is your ordinary Clairefontaine paint on, or any such similar white paper. You want to get rid of any graphite. Remember, coloured pencil is transparent, and so this is how you want to actually start, with everything outlined using the appropriate colour. So I've used red to outline where the bud is, obviously, and green to outline where all the other green bits go. Now, let me just show you my reference. Now, you might be thinking, good grief, she just said we're going to do a red bud, and look, there's a yellow bud. Yes, but this is what you need to start thinking. If you are going to use photographic reference, and if it's in the middle of winter as it is now, there aren't any roses blooming, so I have to work from photographic reference. I liked the shape of that yellow bud, but I want to do a red bud. So what I have done, I have inverted it. I prefer my light to come from my upper left-hand side. And you can see here the light is now on the left. There it was on the right. Because I am right-handed, I prefer to have my light coming upper left. So here I have turned it around, so I've got my light on the side that I prefer. I've also printed it out in grayscale because, to be quite honest, the colour is completely immaterial. I want to see the tonal value. That means I could turn that rose into any colour I liked. It could be white, it could be pink, it could be purple, bluish, green, as you please. I'm going to turn it into a red one, but because I've got quite a clear, well-lit photograph, I can see my light source, and that's all I need. The colours are up to me entirely. So whilst we're talking colours, let's see which colours we're going to use. I'm going to use 3 reds. I'm using Pale Geranium Lake, Deep Scarlet Red, and Dark Red. I will be using Dark Sepia as a tonal tool. More about that later. Greens, Earth Green Yellowish, Chromium Green Opaque, Payne's Grey. These are going to be my burnishing tools. I'm going to use Cold Grey 1, Ivory, and White. Because coloured pencil is basically a transparent medium, you want to start working light through to dark. In my opinion, many people prefer to work the other way. And if you are very experienced, you're quite welcome to choose. However, I find you always run the risk. If you put the darks in too soon, you might not leave enough lights. And because of that, you may run the risk of losing your lights. So I like to make sure I leave them. Now, if I just look at my reference, you will also notice I have made a few changes as I've gone along. This is not a true botanical study. It's more a decorative piece. And because of that, I can make whatever changes I like. As I have drawn it up, I've noticed that sepal, to me, just looks a bit weird at the top of the bud. I didn't like it. It didn't look right. So I've just brought it down. I've kept a similar shape, but I've just brought it down and I've sort of made up that bottom bit. Remember, it's not a pure botanical work. It is more decorative work. But we are going to follow many of the techniques that you would use for a pure botanical work. Don't forget to always have something under your hand. You want to keep your paper as clean as possible, whether you go and put a background on or not. So to start off with, using my lightest red, I am going to lay in a layer of pale geranium lake. Now, I need to work with a sharp point because it keeps me in control of what I'm doing, but I also need to be able to control the pressure. I do need a nice crisp edge, which I will try and keep as crisp as I can throughout the artwork, but may need to crisp it up later. And I'm going to work quite gently. The pressure that I am touching the paper, with which I'm touching the paper, is very gentle. However, as I am going along, although I am not actually working with any darks, I am thinking about where would the light be hitting. Now, I've got a good reference photograph, and it's very clear that this petal is very light, but it's possibly somewhat overexposed in the photograph. Many times photographs are somewhat overexposed and don't actually show all the light areas that you may want. So I have to look at this and be a thinking artist. I know that's a lot to have to contend with. However, it really is worthwhile. You can't just slavishly copy something. You need to actually be aware of what you are copying. So I'm going to try and be a thinking artist as I go along. I actually think that's probably going to come down a little more, even though I can't really see it. This is always the disadvantage of working with a photograph. If you are to be doing a pure botanical study, you need the plant in front of you because you simply cannot get sufficient detail from a photograph. However, if you know a fair bit about plants and you're a thinking artist, you should be able to get around doing a decorative work as this is. Notice there how I've just tickled the paper very, very delicately, because I need to think, where is my light? That area needs to be my lightest light, but I do not want to leave it white. This is not a shiny surface. If I were doing something like a red pepper and I had a very shiny surface, then I would leave it white to begin with. Here, it's not a shiny surface, it's a matte surface, so I am just tickling the paper. And this is where pencil control comes in. Now, many people who may be new to coloured pencil can find pencil control quite a challenge. With a bit of practice, you get used to it. I'm leaving my edge there quite light as well. You can always darken up a section very easily. And this is why I like to work light through to dark. It's very much like working with watercolour, to be quite honest. Both are transparent mediums. And it's easy enough to darken a section, but it's not always easy to lighten a section. Coloured pencil does stain the paper slightly. And because of that, well, it can stain the paper a lot. But because of that, it's difficult to rub back should you not have left an area light enough. So I'm very, very gently applying my first layer as smoothly as I can. And that is quite important. You want to try and get the layer applied as smoothly as possible. You may notice I'm holding the pencil very still. That is because if I twist it slightly, you might just be able to see that oblique angle that is developing. As I am laying in the pencil gently, and a little is rubbing off on the paper, I am developing an oblique angle which helps me lay in the pencil smoothly. If I were to keep twisting the pencil, I would have a constantly sharp point, which you may well need in some instances, but in this instance, I don't. It's quite a challenge to lay it in smoothly. Now, I've got quite a bit of developing to do there, but at this early stage, I just want to get something on the paper very, very gently. If you find it easier to twist your paper around, please do. You will see later on I do a lot of turning around my piece of paper. But in this instance, the shape of the petal allows me to keep the paper still. Please remember, this piece of tracing paper needs to move with your hand. Your hand should never touch the paper. In fact, there are times if you're working in the middle of summer and you're quite hot and sweaty, you should actually have another piece of paper on this side as well, which I could easily, if I could grab another piece of tracing paper, so that really your sweaty fingers are not touching the paper at all. It just keeps the paper clean. You may have washed your hands beforehand, which is always good practice. However, you might touch your face. You've got face cream on, and consequently, it's going to just leave a slight amount of oiliness on the paper, which may not cause any problems, but it might. 5 or 10 years down the line, you may suddenly find a great big dirty mark appearing because it's affected the acidity of the paper. This paper is just ordinary drawing paper and consequently not particularly high quality. However, I still want to get into the habit of working properly. So here I'm thinking now, if I can't see it on my reference, but I'm thinking if the light is shining upper left, there might be just a little bit more of a shadow sneaking in there. Not much, just the thought. And I want to make sure it's very gently blended into the really light area. When you are blending with colored pencil, especially something like this, it's all down to pencil control. There's no other secret involved. It's just pencil control. Here, the same thing applies. The light is likely to be catching that area which is bulging outwards. So I am just putting a small smidgen of shadow there. Notice I'm leaving that area almost untouched at this early stage. Remember, my adage is working light through to dark. It's something I personally prefer. I would rather leave the lights than have to try and erase them later. Same thing could be happening here. There's another curve, so there could be just a smidgen of a shadow coming through there. And as I work my way to the lower part of this particular petal, it is likely to be a little darker anyway, because of the fact of where is my light. So the whole time you are thinking, even though you are only applying your lightest color first, as a thinking artist, you are concentrating the whole time about where you put what. So let's just compare it now to our reference. You can't see any kind of shaping on that petal, and I've changed the shape of the petal slightly as I've drawn it up anyway, so you really can't see much. But because I've thought it through, this area becomes my lightest area, and the rest becomes slightly darker as I go along. That actually needs to be darkened. Be flexible. Remember, you are going to need to chop and change as you go. So that's a good starting point. I'm then going to go to my slightly darker red. Because this is a decorative work, you can choose any color reds you like. If you were doing a species of rose, you would have to be a lot more careful about color matching. This is decorative. I don't have to think too much. This is my deep scarlet red, and all I'm going to do is, particularly over the areas where I am going to add a bit more shadow, I'm just going to put a gentle layer. I'm not going to cover everything, but I am going to put just another gentle layer so that my tone is showing up already at this very early stage. I am thinking, where do my shadows go? Where do my highlights go? So I'm thinking at this very, very early stage about tonal value. Remember, it's all important. You have to have tonal value if you want shape and form. If you have a directional light source, as I always work with the directional light source because I'm right-handed, upper left, notice the shadow. It's away from me. There's shadow being cast by the light source, obviously. I'm working with a slightly different light source because of the video, but I always have the shadow away from me. It doesn't get in the way. And I'm just developing my tone. Now that's going to have to be quite a bit darker later on, but at this early stage, light through to dark, remember, is my preferred way of working. And because of that, I'm just getting it all sorted out in my mind at an early stage. Now, even though, as I start working up here, that part is in shadow, I must make sure I've put a layer of my lightest color first. I have to have it. It's logical. This part of the flower is still the same color as that part of the flower. It just happens to be in shadow. So I need to put a layer first of my lightest red. It allows continuity through your whole artwork. Notice again, I'm just leaving the edge there a little bit lighter at this early stage. Always err on the option of having too much light than not enough light. And then I'm going to do exactly the same as I did down here. I'm simply going in with a little bit of the darker red and just tweaking it up a bit. Down the bottom here is likely to be a little darker than up the top. That might just be catching a little extra light. I am not pressing hard at this stage. I'm pressing very, very gently. Even that little bit that's there, which is turning away and is actually getting quite dark, I need to simply put in a layer of my lightest red first before I go in with my darker red. And you can see at this early stage, I am planning everything very carefully. I'm working from light through to the dark. You may prefer to work the other way around, and that's absolutely fine. It's just I find this suits me best. Now we've got this big expanse of petal here. I'm going to start twisting my paper around a bit because I want to work more or less in the shape of the petal. I don't want to use directional lines. You achieve direction by using tone. So I'm not using directional lines, but my lay-in is preferable if I more or less keep an eye on the shape of the petal, in my opinion. I want to not lose the edge of that petal. I'll show you what I'm going to do in just a minute. But I want a layer of this on first. Now, because of my light source, which is coming from my upper left, I've got to consider again which part of this is likely to be catching the light the most. And I would say, because of the light there, it's going to be here and all the way along the top, because that's pretty flat still. It hasn't unraveled. This one was starting to unravel slightly and is standing away from the back petal. So I'm just starting. I don't want to lose my way. I will just press a little bit harder here. I'm still using the lightest red. We're going to go a whole lot darker. However, I prefer to start with the lights. I know I sound like a stuck record, but it's always good just to remind you why I am doing what I am doing. Right, you can see I'm not losing my edge. Notice I'm now turning the pencil because I've got a nice sharp point. You always need a nice sharp point with coloured pencil. When I've got a big expanse like this, I sometimes find that working in an elliptical motion preferable than just up and down. If you do work in an elliptical motion, do change direction. Notice I'm doing that. 1 minute I'm going clockwise, next minute I'm going anti-clockwise, for no other reason than it lays in better. I must remember, where is my lightest light? Should you be going along happily and forget about your light areas, this is where your Kneadable Eraser can become very, very useful. Make sure it's reasonably clean, and it will just lift out areas if you've gone a little too dark. If you've been chattering away as I have and gone a little too dark, then it just lifts it out. We have many more layers to put on here, and it will go a whole lot darker because, as we've spoken about, it's not a shiny surface. It doesn't need a big bright highlight, but it's always better to err on the side of caution because of the fact that coloured pencil stains the paper, and if you make an area too dark, you are going to battle to get rid of it. Now this is where, as you can see, without even thinking, I am turning the paper around a bit. I just find it easier to keep my hand reasonably still and turn the paper underneath it. It's an entirely personal choice. I just don't like to twist my arm. I find it affects the pressure with which I touch the paper. I find it affects the pressure that I put on the paper with the pencil point. And that can affect the lay-in. So I find it better to turn the paper. And many times I will even work with the paper, let's move that out the way, upside down, because I find it gives me a nicer lay-in position. Here I'm keeping the pencil quite still again. And I've got this lovely oblique angle, which allows a nice smooth lay-in on an area that is quite large. That part of the bud was quite small. This is quite a large area. But I'm doing the same principle. The only slight difference is, because I'm looking at my reference, let me look at my reference, and I'm keeping my reference upside down because my position is now upside down. I'm not worrying too much about leaving this very light edge. Here, the petal behind is particularly dark. So there's a slight variation in the technique. There doesn't have to be, it's just as you go along as a coloured pencil artist, you learn what works best for your subject material. But to be fair, it's so personal, it's really entirely up to you. Right, I want to think now that this top area is going to be quite light, so I want to apply things gently as I go. I can always darken up. So very, very gently. And you will notice, if I could slow myself down, I am actually using this long elliptical stroke. And trying to get the pencil laid in as smoothly as possible. It may seem to be a really simple statement, lay in your pencil smoothly, but trust me, it is quite a challenging thing to do if you do not have natural pencil control. The pencil control will come. For those of you who have not done much coloured pencil work before, or perhaps have done no coloured pencil work before, the pencil control comes. It's like anything, it's a skill that needs to be practiced. This top part here needs to be really quite pale. So I find that where I'm trying to lay in a colour very, very gently to begin with, I find a shorter stroke, a shorter elliptical stroke is often easier. You can notice immediately I have shortened the stroke. Now, some coloured pencil artists actually prefer to lay in their base layer and subsequent layers actually using a circular motion like this, where you're really just doing a little circle. And that is fine for some people. I find it would drive me gently dotty. It's just a bit too slow for me. However, if you do use a circular stroke, you will not get any directional marks. So it does have its advantages. But personally, I find it a little too slow. I prefer the ellipse. It's kind of between straight lines and circles, and it suits me better. But that's just me. Like any art form, your style of working becomes very, very personal and quite a reflection of who you are, which is quite a worrying statement. But don't let it worry you. Right, I'm going to turn it the other way around in a minute because I want to work on that side, and I want to just double check what I'm doing at the top there. But you can see it's quite a reasonable lay in that. Right, let's just lay this part in here. I'm twisting the pencil because now I need a little bit of a point so that I can use my lightest red still, just a little, with a little more oomph. When you are doing coloured pencil work, do remember you need a paper that is strong enough to support the many layers. Now, it does depend on you as an individual. I like to put many layers on my work. I'm going to keep this part just a little bit lighter so I don't lose my way. Many coloured pencil artists work very gently and consequently don't need many layers. I am inclined to work with plenty oomph and welly because that's how I like it. And consequently, I need a paper that is going to support my many layers. Sorry, I've just left a little bit out there. I think that's better. That makes a bit more sense. I know that this Clairefontaine paint on, it's useless for paint, but it's really nice as a coloured pencil paper for exercise type quality work. It's not archival, and consequently you wouldn't use it for a really good piece of work. You would use a rag paper, but the types of paper you use, well, that's another whole video. Okay, so I want to think as well with this petal exactly as I did with that petal. Where am I likely to get other little dents and things showing up? Here, because of the fact the light would be catching that section, as it dips away, I am likely to have a little bit more tone coming through. And because I have a larger petal to work on, some of this shadow actually may link to the bottom. Thinking about the overall shape of a rose petal, but you do have to be very cautious. You do not make any unnecessary evenness because plants are not even. So you've got to be quite careful about it. If I did that all the way to the bottom, then my next one next to it would not be to the bottom because it would just look weird in an artwork. I might have a little bit of darkness coming up here. It's very gentle. You will see what I mean. I'm really doing it quite gently. Some of those top bits, I don't think I've left light enough. So I'm going in with my Kneadable Eraser and I'm just lifting out a small little section of it. Just lightening my lights slightly. I was obviously talking too much and not thinking enough. And you can see how it will just lift out a little bit, but it's not going to take it right back to white paper. When I have lifted out an area, I must just make sure I'm blending things softly again. There's another dip. So that again would be a darkening. And right next to it, there's another dip. So those two dips might actually link together and work my way back down into the petal. A lot of this will need further darkening, but always better to err on the side of a little bit of light. This side now is going to get darker because it's curving around. It's going towards my shadow side. So I can just put another layer, still my lightest red, another layer down. I might just keep that slightly lighter, but not too light. I find it a bit easier to twist it. And put another layer down, and as I go towards the base here, there will also be a bit more. As you darken areas, you will notice other areas appear lighter. That's the optical illusion of tonal value and the usefulness of a Kneadable Eraser if I've been a bit too exuberant. Okay, now I'm going to go in with my darker red and do exactly the same as what I did here. Areas that are going to be shadowed. They're not shadowed yet, mind. I'm just thinking that way at this stage. Areas that are going to be shadowed are going to have a little more red added. But I must make sure that the blend between my slightly darker red and my lightest red is very gradual. I don't want any hard lines. Now we've got a lot darker to go, and remember we still have dark red and dark sepia to put in. But at this early stage, it's fine to do it this way. Let me just flip this upside down because I find it easier to keep that in front of me. The main thing you have to consider when you are considering tonal value at a very early stage is always put a layer of the lighter red first. Remember, shadow is simply the rose seen in light and dark. You've not changed color. You can't. That part there, for example, is very shadowed. Let me show you the reference. Look how shadowed that is. Now I can't go into that area with only dark red because it's not dark red. It's actually my lightest red in shadow. So you do have to use a fair bit of thought when you are laying in these initial layers. Your initial layers are all important. It's like building a house. If you get the initial layers correct, that's fine. Your artwork will always stand accurately. It's like a house. If you don't get your foundations right, the thing is going to collapse. And the same thing happens here. Right? You can see that working. I actually think I could put a little more color on my first petal. This is what I say, be flexible. Look at what you have in front of you and make a decision based on what's in front of you. Just because you start one way doesn't mean that that way is always correct. Again, I was erring, trying to get through to you to be cautious. Err on the side of caution, leave your lights. Do not lose your lights. However, looking at the two, I can see that a little bit more color on the paper is a good thing. You will understand why you need sufficient color on the paper as we progress on through these stages. So I'm still making sure I'm leaving sufficient light, very little pressure on the paper. It's repeated layering. Because it's a transparent medium, repeated layering is what actually darkens until we get on to the next stages. Here I could put a little more in as well. I know that that needs to be a bit darker, but I don't want to darken it too soon, otherwise I'm going to lose where I'm going. And we're going to progress along in the same manner on all these petals. Now we're ready for the next step. Here we have laid in all the color absolutely adequately. There is enough pencil on the paper. Our tonal value is accurate. We may need to darken some areas. It's very likely we are going to need to darken some areas. But at this stage, it's accurate enough. You've got shape and form. Let's have a look at our black and white version again. Now we're ready for the next step, and this step depends on you as an individual. I like to burnish my coloured pencil work. By burnishing, I mean a mixing and blending of all the colour and the tone. However, I don't do it at the end, as is often the way. I like to do it now and then put on subsequent layers. It's a case of what do you burnish with? Well, when in doubt, use white. It's as simple as that. So I am going to burnish my red Rosebud by using white. I don't use burnishing pencils. I simply use the white with a fair bit of pressure. And you can see how it mixes the oiliness of the actual Faber Castell pencil, and it takes away the texture. Now this, to my mind, is a way of creating a coloured pencil painting. Beforehand it looks pretty much like a drawing in as much as you can see the pencil marks, and that is absolutely fine if that is the technique that you want. However, I like to turn my coloured pencil drawing into a coloured pencil painting, and I find that burnishing is the first step. Now I am pressing quite firmly, and you will notice that I'm burnishing in a very orderly fashion, petal by petal. I'm not just going wild over the entire thing. Pressing quite firmly, you can see there's still a little texture coming through there, but that's not a problem. The more pencil you have on the paper, after the burnish, the less texture shows. But we don't want to lose our lights, so it was important to make sure we left them with just a tickle of pencil. Notice the difference now between that petal and this one. So I'm going to continue burnishing. Now you can burnish with all sorts of colours, and every subject has a different possible requirement. However, I find that if I'm doing flowers, I like to try and keep the burnishing quite simple, and I stick to just the white. However, I will show you a technique as we progress through these sepals, however you say the word, if that's what they're called. As we progress through, how we will vary our burnishing tools just slightly, and you'll understand the logic behind that. Again, if you notice, I'm actually using an elliptical motion. In a big area like this, it just seems to help. And I'm pressing firmly. You need to press firmly. If you just tickle, watch, I'll show you. Nothing happens. You need to press firmly. A burnish is applied with a bit of oomph and welly. You actually can hear the pencil. If you listen, you don't hear it at all. Now, when I'm burnishing with oomph and welly, you can actually hear the pencil on the paper. And this is another reason why I suggest you use a paper that can cope with the pressure. Look at my pencil, far too blunt. You might hear that battery-operated sharpener. Again, it's a personal thing. You can use whatever sharpener you like. I just prefer a battery-operated one rather than one of those hurdy-gurdy ones that you twist round and round and round. I just find it more practical. Those hurdy-gurdy ones are supposed to be better for your pencils. They don't twist the lead within the pencil. However, I go through so many pencils that, to be quite honest, I don't find it to be a problem. In all the years I've been doing coloured pencil work, my battery-operated sharpener has never damaged a pencil yet. But it's personal choice. Some people prefer to use a blade. I don't find I can get a sharp enough point with blade. Right, I'm going along this way because I want to do it in a nice orderly fashion. And I want the edge to be quite nice and crisp and sharp. Again, even though you are pressing firmly, do try and keep the pressure constant. It comes with practice. You get a feeling for how hard you need to press. You'll notice it's all going milky in colour. That's absolutely fine. always keep your work covered up. Now, although you're not going for a huge amount of detail, when your point starts to get blunt like that, it's really worthwhile sharpening it. What happens is the blunter the point, the harder you have to press to get the burnish to be successful. And if you are working on some watercolor papers, which are rag and obviously softer than this good old tough everyday kind of paper, you may find the surface starts to break up. There are quite a lot of watercolor papers that will break up, but equally there are a lot that will cope with your pressures. It depends on you as an individual artist, how much pressure you do or don't apply. The old-fashioned Fabriano Artistico was a fabulous paper. Then in their foolishness, they decided to change it, and now it's pretty disastrous. I am struggling to find another paper that I like. Many watercolor papers have got external sizing, which comes away as you burnish, and consequently you get lumps and bumps, and it's very unpleasant. Arches is not bad. But you don't quite get the crispness of application. It can be, at the moment, quite a challenge to find a really nice watercolor paper that's good, archival quality, and that does not break up under colored pencil. Bristol boards are a good option if you can't find a hot pressed watercolor paper that suits. Make sure that every bit is burnished. You will notice here, because I've got quite a lot of pencil on the paper, the burnish creates a lovely smoothness. However, bear in mind we are doing a rose, so that slight graininess there is not necessarily a problem, because it just adds a little bit of reality. It all depends on the subject matter and what you're hoping to achieve. Okay, let's have a look at that now and see how that looks. That looks fine. Now, you would use exactly the same technique for the leaves, but I will do a little bit of extra talking about the leaf. That down there, I forgot about. So it's a very dark area. However, I need to put my lightest red first. Remember, we spoke about that earlier. So I'm going to put in a layer of my lightest red, which is the pale geranium lake. I am pressing quite firmly, however, because it is pretty dark. But it's pretty shadowed, as opposed to a strange and new dark colour. Then I will go in with my slightly darker red and put a layer of that on as well. And then I will burnish it so that it's all consistent throughout the artwork and it doesn't look like a strange patchwork of different techniques. After the burnish, you need to go back with the same colours that you used before. This method of working is a slow method. However, I find it gives me a painterly finish, which I prefer. Again, it's personal. It's what you as the individual artist prefers. I am going to start introducing a little dark red as we go along. There will be areas where I introduce dark sepia as well, but let's just work with these. Okay, now that you've got a burnish down, you're going to have a lovely smooth surface on which to put subsequent layers. Crisp up that edge. Make that edge nice and sharp. The green behind is going to bump that up a bit more. I'm using my lightest red. And I'm working now, apart from just crisping up the edge, I'm working mainly in the lighter areas because my lightest red is what is in the lightest area. I could put it all over, but it just makes more work and is not really worth it. So I'm working with my lightest red, mainly in the lighter areas. And I am pressing as hard or as soft as I need to achieve a nice smooth lay-in, extra lay-in of colour. And I usually do little bit by little bit, because otherwise I can easily lose my place. I'm now going in with the darker red, and I'm putting a little bit more oomph where I can see those shadows. There's not much difference between these. However, you will find that with red, it's quite a dead colour. It kind of goes clunk, and you need something else mixed in. So I never use just one red. I always use more than one red, and I just find it gives me a better finish. My white line there looks quite obvious. I know that. Don't worry. You will find it'll tone down as we go along. Remember, I told you it's all about layering. With red and a rose, it's definitely all about layering. The more layers you put on, the better. I'm going to start introducing a little dark. In areas where I know there is a bit more of a definite shadow, I'm introducing some dark. Now, your dark coloured pencils always take quite vigorously. And this is another reason I like to use them towards the end. You will always get them to take. In this particular make of the Faber Castell, you do have a problem if you work with other makes, but in this particular make, the dark Faber Castell always takes. However, if you have got many lighter layers down first, it will not take too strongly. And that is something you have to consider, which again is the reason I work from light through to dark. I'm just putting in that with a tickle, then I'm going back over with a little of the darker red. So I'm working with 3 to hand easily, so I can constantly look at what is in front of me. I am going to get rid of that white line. Don't let it worry you. However, it just keeps my eye where I want it to be kept. Right, lighter red in the highlighted areas. So here we go, another layer of lighter red as smoothly as possible. Because you have a burnish, you will find it easier to get subsequent layers applied in more smoothly. You should not need to do too much extra burnishing. However, I might need to do a little mini burnish on that area. I'll show you. I'll put one in so you can see. The whole time you are looking at your individual petal. Now, again, it's personal choice whether you work petal by petal or whether you work up the entire flower. I personally prefer on a rose to work petal by petal. I just find it works better. A rose is quite a complex subject. Fortunately, we're doing just a bud, so it's not too bad. This is my slightly darker red, but not my dark red yet. And I'm working towards blending these 2 reds together. Again, it's this pencil control and many repeated soft layers as opposed to suddenly pressing too hard, because that's not really helpful. Let's just tickle a little bit in there. There may be places you need to press a little harder. That's fine. You need to alter it as you go along. Let's go in with the dark red. Generally, the darker the colour, the more gently you apply it, and you don't need to apply quite as much. I find when we get to the real shadow side and we start working with the dark sepia, you'll see what I mean. The darker the dark, the less of it you have to apply. But it does allow the other colours to glow through. And that is what gives you this amazing wall appeal that can be achieved with coloured pencil. Obviously, it can be achieved with many mediums. But I'm a little bit sort of... My tendency is to go towards, obviously, the coloured pencil. Right, again, that dark red needs a little bit of the sort of in-between dark red, just to help smooth things out a little bit. Then I'm going back with a little more of my lighter red. Again, it's all about this beautiful, beautiful, effortless blend that you are going to achieve. It's pencil, it takes ages. The whole point of this medium, there's a lovely saying, the comforting tedium of the medium. The joy of coloured pencil is you can pick it up and put it down at any stage. You don't have to worry if the phone should ring. You don't have to worry if you suddenly have to go and cook supper. It's not going to do anything to a delicate watercolour wash, for example, because there aren't any. It's all about this delicate blending. Now, I may need a slight mini burnish on that area just to smooth things down a little. Because coloured pencil is a transparent medium, the white will not lighten an area that well. It will lighten it slightly. Let me show you. And just in this area, I am not going to burnish the whole thing. But because I want this area a little smoother, circular stroke, changing direction here and there, I'm just putting a little mini burnish in that area. And you can see that everything is just smoothed down slightly, not the whole thing. If you keep continually burnishing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, you're going to end up damaging the surface of the paper. So you've just got to think it through. I shouldn't need to do any burnishing down here, any mini burnishing, because I'm going in with my slightly darker red now, thinking where are the main areas of shadow going to be. Remember, when you are using the darker colours, you press as firmly or as gently as you need to. And just because I'm putting levels of dark on at this stage does not mean I may not have to go back. This is just the start of the dark. It's very important to remember that without the darks, there will be no illusion of lights. So many times you have to put on a little more dark than you anticipate. But if you put it on, as I am doing towards the end, you are allowing all the other colours to glow through. Remember, coloured pencil is transparent to a degree. And you are allowing these other colours to glow through. So it's not just a case of one colour. I've used 3 reds on that petal and a little white. I could have used more. I could easily have used 4 or 5 reds. If I'd wanted it slightly pinker, I would have put pink down first. If I'd wanted slightly yellower, I may have put a layer of yellow down. It's a case of deciding what you want. If you were doing a true botanical work, you may have to put up to 6 or 7 colours to achieve. You can't mix on a palette after all. You can only mix on your paper. But that is starting to develop a really rich glow. And that's the whole point of coloured pencil. You can achieve amazing glowing colours as you work your way through. Now this part here may not need much of the light red, but I actually think I just need to define my edge a bit. Let me just go in, nice sharp point. You see it really is a sharp point. And just define the edge a bit. Needs to be nice and crisp. And I'm not going to press terribly hard. It might just be catching a little extra light, but maybe not quite as much light as that. But it's giving me a nice sharp outline. Crisp edges are very important in botanical type studies. You need those crisp edges. There are times where a softer edge will work, but you actually do really want to work towards as sharp an edge as you can in the foreground parts. Now I will go in with my dark red. This is a perfect place where the dark red really makes things start to pop. And we will go in later as we work our way around with a little dark sepia down here, because you definitely will need it. Nice sharp point. The sharper the point, the less the pressure, which is always a good thing. But obviously in small areas, you've got to be a bit more cautious. A blunt point would just take you off and give you a rather untidy mark. Right, that's looking fine. When you have lots of these little bits of pencil floating around, a good habit to get into is using a very soft brush and brushing it away. You can, of course, as I'm inclined to do, blow it, but then you run the risk of spitting on your work, which is not very hygienic. Okay, so now we're going to work our way around and develop every single petal, just as we did here. This one's going to be an interesting one to work up, because here we can start to really bump up some of the darks, and that can be an interesting one to work up. To help me, I'm actually going to put that dark in now, because then what that does, it allows me to compare all subsequent darks. If I look at my black and white version, a tonal grayscale version of whatever you are drawing is essential, because it allows you to compare your tonal value. And on that part of the bud, that dark is the darkest dark. It's about as dark as some of the tones on the leaves, which we will get onto later. So we want to really be able to put that in with a bit of oomph. And that is where I'm also going to put in some dark sepia. Now, dark sepia is a brown. It's always a bit of a challenge. What do you tone red with? If you're following the experts, they'll tell you to use green. I do not like to use opposites on the color wheel when I'm working with reds and greens in colored pencil. I find the green goes clunk. There's no other word for it. It goes clunk. It makes a horrible mark. So I prefer to use things that are on the same side of the color wheel. In other words, some of the browns. And I'm going to go in with my dark sepia, which is very dark. But I'm going to check carefully where I'm putting my darkest darks. I'm not pressing hard. That's the joy of doing the darks at the end, as I've mentioned repeatedly. The darks at the end allow you to control exactly where you put them and the level at which you apply them. So I'm looking carefully where I want my darkest darks, and I'm just gently tickling them in, quite softly. Whenever I use something dark, really dark, like the dark sepia, you always need to put some more of the local colour on top of it, because the rose has not got a large blob of brown at the bottom of it. It's in shadow. I know I've said that a couple of times, but I have learned that many people get a bit confused by that, and they forget that you're actually applying shadow on top of colour. It's not a different colour. I hope that made sense. Right, so now I've got some really dark in. I'm going to go in with my dark red on top of it. And I'm pressing reasonably firmly now, and I'm just going in with my dark red on top. And I'm allowing the dark red to blend a little further in and over the red that is already there and has been burnished. Right, so I'm pressing firmly. Nice sharp point at this stage. You don't have to press too firmly, so you're not likely to be damaging the paper. Then I will go in with a little bit of my next red and just bump it all up and just pull it together. And you can see the glow, even though that's a really deep and dark shadow, you can see a glow from it. And that's the whole point. You don't want your shadows to be dead and heavy, but tonally they need to be dark enough. Remember, without the darks, there will be no lights. I've made that a bit untidy, so let me just go and sort that out at the bottom. That's better. So now that gives me my darkest dark. I may need to go, I just see there's a bit of a blend there that could be improved upon. I may need to go a little darker still, but I don't think so. That basically gives me my darkest dark. Now, when I add the tone on this petal, I can actually see how it compares. If I look at my grayscale again, I can see how it compares. There's quite a lot of dark there. I'm going to be aware of this dark here, which is actually a cast shadow. This petal is casting a shadow, and I'm always loath to have a very straight edge. This is reasonably soft, but you can compare everything and see how it all relates. You've got that one complete now. Now you've got your darkest dark in, and it allows you to compare everything else. So we're going to get onto that now. Working slowly. Don't even think you can work fast with coloured pencil, because you can't. You will have noticed that I added a little colour into the stalk. Light first, followed by dark. So I've not changed the technique at all from that which I used on the rose to what I've now used down there. That section there is now ready to burnish. But before we do that, I want to continue with some of these sepals. With anything like this, Obviously, the rose is actually designed to be the focal point of this artwork. However, you do have these green bits, but you've got to consider them quite carefully. You do not want them to dominate. So you have to consider a little bit of perspective, depth of field. How are you going to recede some of these in the background so that they don't pop forward? If you were to do that one really dark with lots of tonal value and strength of color, you would find it would start vibrating against the top part of your rose. Remember, rose is focal point. And so you need to recede that slightly. So let's just have a quick look and do these three and show you what I mean. Okay, first things first, we're going to start with our lightest green, as is the way I usually always start. Lightest green, lay in the color. I've got the drawing reasonably accurate. We're going to have an interesting crissy-crossy here with the leaf, actually sepal, turns and twists. I'm going to show you the technique I use. You're more than welcome to use whichever technique you like, but I use this one. So I'm pressing a little harder there with the light green, simply so that I do not lose that sort of mid-rib of the leaf. And I'm just going to lay in some light green quite gently. Now, you will become aware as we work with the green that green has a tendency to clump. I notice here as well, just to interrupt, when I put in that red part of the bud, I actually infringed a bit onto the green. So I'm going to try and erase it back. Now, I've done quite a lot on that red, and I didn't really notice it. These little erasers, the Tombow erasers, can be very useful because of the fact they're narrow at the bottom, and consequently you can control them quite well. So that will not erase completely, but by the time I have finished the green part, you should hardly notice it. Right, again, trying to keep the edges quite crisp as I work my way down. And if you need to twist it around, feel free. Okay, so I'm going to put a layer here as well. And you will notice if I were to slow my motion down, I'm doing exactly the same as what I did on the rose. I'm working in this rather long elliptical stroke because I find it the easier. But again, it's up to you. You will develop your own stroke that will be easiest for you. Now here, we've got to be a little careful because we're running green right into green. But I'm going to just put it in anyway. Okay, now we get to where the twist is. I need a sharp point. Okay, what I do when I have got a twist on any leaf is I make sure that I've got like a little tram line of light. If you look really closely, you will see this little tram line of light, which I leave almost white. I've left it white at the moment so that you can actually see it. So if you have a really close look, you will notice that little tram line of light. And what that does, it immediately, and I'll twist it around in just a second so that you can see. And if I put a little green here as well, you'll see that the actual lightness even more obviously. That little white tram line actually gives you an immediate separation. As this twists, by leaving that little white edge, it really helps give you that separation. Now, the reason I do that is because many plants have got transparent cells along the edge, particularly leaves, but I'm using the technique here as well because I know it's going to work to my advantage. They've got a row of transparent cells. Some of the very waxy leaves, you can see it quite clearly. You look at a camellia leaf, you can actually see those transparent cells. And so as a leaf twists, it's that leading edge that I'm almost leaving to the viewer to look at, and so that they understand the twist. You can see how much easier that is than just trying to do it with tone. We're going to put a lot of tone in there, but this gives easier understanding. In my opinion, it's just a technique I use. Obviously, you can use your own technique entirely, particularly if you are an experienced artist. By now, I'm sure you found out your own technique, what works best for you. I find that's very successful on leaves. Now I've done my base coat using the lighter green and use a darker green. The greens I use mostly are one called Earth Green Yellowish, because I like the yellowness within it. And then there's another one called Chromium Green Opaque. I find within the range of coloured pencils, many of the greens are quite blue. Now that's fine if you're doing a leaf or whatever that needs quite a blue tinge to it. But I do find that many of the actual greens are too blue, whereas this green is not terribly blue. And there is another one called Chrome Green Oxide, which is a little darker than this and is also not very blue. When I want to start putting tonal value in this side of the sepal, you've got to bear in mind your light source direction. Because of the twist and the curve, this side is going to be pretty shadowed. Perhaps a little bit of light will be caught there, but most of it is going to be quite shadowed. So although this is quite a simple structure that we're doing, you've got to consider your tonal value throughout. So there I'm filling in my dark. You can see I've just left a little bit of light. Remember, as with the rose, I like to err on the side of leaving light. I can always go back and darken it up. Right, to get in that light, there might be a bit of shadow here. So I'm just leaving that little bit of light at this stage. I may well go back and darken it, but at this stage, it works. It gives it shape, it gives it form, and that's the whole point of tonal value, obviously. Okay, now we're going to do something just a little different, and that is why I wanted to leave this stalk and this sepal, I never know which way around it should be, because we're going to consider the whole way around. When we're doing these, we want to consider our perspective, our depth of field. Sorry, I forgot to put a bit of green on this bit here, because this is all part of the foreground. It's a little fat, that, so maybe I'll just make it a bit skinnier. That's why working gently to begin with, there's always the option of erasing anything that you may have drawn up inaccurately. Whilst coloured pencil won't erase completely, like that little line I could get out. Let's have a look now and see what that looks like. That looks fine. Okay, so now I have to consider the whole time, this is my focal point, but I do want accuracy and detail on all the rest. I'm ignoring that at this stage. I'm just going to work on this side of the plant so that we can see this perspective technique. What I'm going to do as a burnishing tool, remember with the rose, I used white to burnish everything. With the stalk, I'm going to use white. However, with this sepal, I am going to use something slightly different, as with those two. So let's just get on and do the burnish. Now, the burnish is exactly the same as what we did on the rose. So the techniques that I follow are very, very consistent throughout the actual artwork. And I would say I use these techniques for pretty much most flowers, plants that I might draw. So it's pretty basic. You lay in the basic colour, considering tonal value from the beginning, but not putting in the darkest darks. Then you burnish using white or an ivory, as you will see, and even in places a cold grey one, which you will also see. And then generally you go back with your colours that you laid in to begin with, and you emphasize them and make it a strong image. Now, obviously, this kind of technique depends entirely on you as an individual. If you do not like very bright, bold colors, your application may be different, but you won't know until you've tried. All I can say is this technique has worked for me, and it works for many people. All right, so I've burnished with white. I am going to use ivory to burnish this sepal. Now, the reason being, ivory has a little yellow in it, as you can see. And because of that, it will warm up this green fractionally. It's not going to yell at you, but it is going to be noticeable. So I'm going to use this to burnish this sepal. And the reason being is that is actually the part of the plant that's closest to me. You all know, or if you don't, you're going to be told now, warm colours come forward, cold colours recede, generally speaking. If you use a warmer colour as a burnishing tool in a foreground object, there will be a subtle difference to using a colder burnishing tool in a background object. This technique is really, really very, very effective when doing a lot of leaves. If you were doing a plant that had a lot of leaves, you would have to have some way of showing difference between all the leaves. And this is one of the easiest ways of doing it. Now you can see there's not a screaming difference, but once it's all completed, you do just see a subtle difference. Anything that you do introduce into a botanical type artwork mustn't yell at you, but it really does work to your advantage. Right, that's got a little fuzzy, that tip at the edge, but we're going to sort it out now. Okay, so now we're going to go back and we're going to do exactly the same thing using the same colors. We're going to reinforce the light. We're going to add more dark green, and we are going to add a tonal color. So the technique is exactly the same as what we did for the red rose. Once we had burnished, we go back. But this time we're going to add a slightly different tonal color, and you'll see why. All right, so I'm going to go back with the light green. Make sure my edges, notice my nice sharp point. Make sure my edges are good and crisp. You want nice crisp edges. And I'm just reinforcing the color because it looks a bit wishy-washy. Now, this slightly sort of milky effect can be very, very useful in some plants. For example, if you're doing a bunch of grapes, that milky effect actually gives you very much the bloom that you want on your grapes anyway. So like any art, you've got to be flexible. Just because you use one technique in one plant doesn't mean you're going to use it always. I'm going to make sure I've got a bit of lightness coming through there, not too much at the top there, because after all these things are casting shadows. But here on the stalk, there might be a little bit of lightness. So as I did on the petals, there are areas that you press quite firmly, and then there are other areas that you will press a little more gently. Now, the green pigment has a tendency to clump. There's no other way to describe it. I don't know why it does it. It clumps. It kind of builds up in waxy layers. Don't worry much about it. No one's ever said to me, goodness, your greens are clumpy. What you have to bear in mind, though, is when you apply the greens at this stage, do so with a reasonable amount of pressure. Don't tickle too much, because if you tickle, you're inclined to build up clumps of oil-based pencil on top of other clumps of oil-based pencil, and the clumping gets worse. So there are actually times you need to press quite firmly to kind of squash the clumps down. I know that sounds really untechnical, but that's the best way of describing it. And it's the same thing as I am adding the darker green. I am allowing it to blend into the lighter green by altering my pressure on the pencil. So there are places I press really vigorously, and there's other places I just tickle. And you can see that working quite nicely. I may go back with a little bit of the lighter green on the join where the dark and the light meet. I look and see what's in front of me and see what I think would work the best. Then I'm going to use, once I've done this little bit here, I'm going to use a tonal tool. Now, a tonal tool, remember, is something that is completely different to what you're actually working with, but will help add extra tonal value to the color. Now, as I mentioned with the red, I do not like mixing red and green, as is the traditional way of darkening either of the color. Perhaps when you work on a palette, you are more successful. In colored pencil, I personally find that the resulting tone is very dead. It's flat. It goes clonk. And so I don't do it. So what I do often with green, now you can use dark sepia to tone green as well. However, I use quite a lot of Payne's Grey. Payne's Grey, having a little blue in it, is on the same side of the color wheel as green. It's on the cooler side of the color wheel. And I find Payne's Grey is a very useful tonal tool for green. You'll see now when I add it. Let's just look at that and see if that's all making sense the right way up. There could probably be just an extra little bit of dark down here as the curve of the stem dictates, thinking about where the light is going to be catching it the whole time. All right, now I need some good darks. So I'm going to go in with Payne's Grey. I am going to apply it in exactly the same manner as I did on the Rosebud. This area here, I will apply it quite gently. Remember, the darks take more strongly, and consequently you need to apply them gently and build it up rather with repeated gentle layers than pressing too hard too soon. Because should you press too hard too soon, you've got to go right back and try and remove it. So you can see I'm lingering in an area a fair while. And you can see how that's just given me that extra little dark. It's just allowed my shadow areas to pop. That old saying, which I've said repeatedly, without the darks, there will be no lights. However, again, the amount of dark that you do apply does depend on the overall artwork. If you were doing a very delicately colored, let's just say yellow flower, you would have to be careful you didn't go in with terribly strong darks, because it actually could grubby the yellow. So you have to be a thinking artist. You've really got to think through what you are doing and why you are doing it. It's not just a case of sitting there and following a very simple recipe. Whilst this is not a difficult technique to master, you do have to think past just the doing. You've got to think past what you're hoping to achieve. So you can see if I just work a little bit up here with a bit of oomph, I press as hard or as soft as I need to strengthen the tone. Always after applying a little of the tonal tool, I go back and I put a layer of green on, because I don't want the tonal tool to look like something different. And you can see the difference now between this little section that has been done and that has not been done. It just strengthens the shadow area a bit more. Now, some of you who may be thinking, why is there no reflective light being shown? There are times, in my opinion, when reflective light doesn't need to be shown. And in a simple object like this that is making a statement on its own, it's standing sort of boldly on the piece of paper, I don't think there is the need to necessarily have reflected light on your dark side. Again, it's my personal opinion. You can disagree with pleasure. I just don't think there is the need. A statement object like this almost looks better having your darkest dark next to your lightest light, which is your paper. It really adds wall appeal, and you put that in a simple frame from across a room, it hits you between the eyes. However, it does depend on your subject and what you are doing. So let's just tickle in a tiny little bit more dark there. I'll turn it the right way in just a second. Let's put some dark in here. Again, you will notice I like to move my paper around simply because I can keep my arm still. And I just find it the easier way of working. If you don't enjoy doing that, don't. You can keep your paper still and move your arm around. It's just an individual way of approaching it. You will notice that when you've got many layers of coloured pencil, particularly the good quality ones like the Faber Castell, it doesn't actually matter if you twist it around and you're almost cross-hatching, although my strokes are extremely close together. The oil content of the pencil allows it to mix amazingly, which I even though I use these pencils probably nearly every day of my life, I still find it quite astonishing what they can do. It's a humble pencil, but if you just look at the finished artwork, you don't necessarily know. It's that layerability that is so amazing. Let's just pop a little more green on the top of that as well. Right, so now we've done exactly what we did on the rose, and we're going to do the same to the rest of this sepal. Let me just use my soft brush to get rid of some of my little bits. If you don't clean up the paper as you go along, you will find that the tracing paper is inclined to smudge those little bits and can make it grubby. However, your kneadable eraser is really, really useful just for lifting off any grubbiness that might occur. And it's not a bad practice to get into, just looking and seeing if there's any grubbiness, clean it up before it gets really entrenched in the piece of paper. Okay, now we want to do this. And the same thing, we're going to go in with the light green where it is light green and build up the darks. So here I'm going to go in with my lighter green. Notice I'm leaving that little light edge. Now it may not be visible if I were working from life. However, I'm looking at the artwork and thinking it would probably look better if I just, especially against the red, because tonally the green and the red, if I were to photocopy it on grayscale, would be quite similar. And so the whole time I am thinking, keep my tones separate to have the greatest effect. So I've gone in with the lighter green. Now I go in with the darker green. Now you could, once you've done your basic lay-in, if you found it easier to go in with the darker green first so you didn't lose your way, there's nothing to stop you. It's obviously up to you as an individual artist to work out what you find easiest to do. I've just got into this habit of always making sure I don't lose my lights. But that's just a personal thing. Right, when I've got my dark down there, I must remember to blend it quite gently into that green. And the same down here, blend it quite gently into that green. Here I am using quite a linear stroke because of the shape of the sepal. Now this is not, this is the vein traveling up it. And so I'm not going to blend between that and that. It's giving me shape. Notice here my row of slightly transparent cells, which I'm not going to emphasize too much, but I do want it there. It just allows the viewer to understand what you're about, in my opinion. I don't want to leave them completely white. It does take quite a steady hand to practice that. But it does help, I think, to separate things out. Okay, I need to go in with a little bit now of Payne's Grey. When you are working on small, rather defined areas, please keep your point sharp. Now, this mid vein here, I must be very aware that it actually relates to that mid vein there. So the two must meet. The only thing that's separating them is this little bit of narrow whiteness. Just down to observation, if you really, really sit and look at a leaf as it folds over, you will notice that mid vein is what helps you actually see where everything's going. Right, so that's my really darkest point. And there is some dark here as well. This is where, once I've added the dark, I can look and I can say, is that lightness I left a little too light? And if it is, I will just slowly tone it in. So I'm just going to bounce that up a bit, because that point, remember, this is my foreground sepal, and so I want it very sharp. And I think I will just tone that down a bit with just a tickle of the lightest green, and that gives it enough definition. I can see it against that quite clearly. Now I'm going to do exactly the same on the lower half. My lighter green first, because this is the area that is likely to be catching just this area, a little bit of a highlight, and the mid vein. Generally the back of leaves and or sepals, the vein sticks out a little proud. Not all of them, so again it's down to observation, but often. And that'll do there. Then I'm going to go in with my darker green. Remember this, although I am following many botanical principles, this is a decorative artwork. It's not designed to be 100% botanically accurate. However, I do think that if you draw it in a believable enough fashion, it makes all the difference. Right, so that vein, if it's standing proud, is going to cast a small shadow. So the line there has just strengthened that shadow up. And I'm just going to put a bit of dark down the bottom here, because this part would obviously be quite shadowed. Now, I did speak about there being no reflected light on the side there, and there's not. However, let me just finish this. And I think that that could actually just have a little bit of lighter green. I don't want it too light, but it might just be catching a little bit because of the shape and because of the light source. I think it would look better with a little bit of lighter green. If you look very, very closely down here, I have left a small area of lightness between that dark tone and this dark tone. When I put the Payne's Grey on top of it, if I were to have not left that small area of lightness, it's small, it's just a little smidgen, those two dark tones would run into each other and you lose definition. Consequently, just leaving that small, it is almost a little area of reflected light, if we're trying to name it, just leaving that small area of a slightly lighter tone is enough to add just that little smidgen of separation between the two areas. So oftentimes when you are working with two dark tones or two light tones that are very similar and you're working with them together, you need to just leave that little area. You can see I'm actually doing it here as well. That dark tone and that dark tone, I'm talking only tonally, are actually very similar. And if I were to run this into it, although the color is different, the tones are very, very similar. If I just leave a small little bit of lightness, small and subtle little bits of lightness really do make a difference if you're considering the tone constantly. But it does all depend on your subject matter. If you are working with very delicate flowers that you may not have as strong a tonal value as what I am putting in here, then it's not quite as important. Although you must consider it, even if you are working with a slightly paler tone, it really is worthwhile. The importance of tonal value is huge. Well, I mean, you all know that, I'm sure. But it really, really is important. It's more important than color. So you can see down there the very delicate tone. Now my vein also needs tone. So the lower half of my vein needs to be slightly darker than the upper half that's catching the light. It's small things, but, well, I suppose it makes me happy. I don't know if it'll make you happy, but it makes me happy. I think if you are a bit of a perfectionist, it's those little things that just make you feel as if you're doing the best that you can possibly do. Now this white line here is too white. I don't want it as white as that. I left it white to begin with. Remember, I said I don't like losing my light. So I'm just going to tickle a little green over it now, just to tone it down a bit. It was yelling at me. It was a bit too white. I want it light, but I don't want it white. Right, so we'll just put a little smidgen. And you can see how that's just toned it down a touch. Now we need to do something about this because it's yelling. And that's fine. Remember, it's got to be a bit different. If you look very closely, you may not see it on the video, but there is a subtle difference between the finished color of this and the finished color of that. Because of my burnish, I had basically introduced a layer of a little bit of pale yellow into that, and consequently my greens are just slightly brighter. It's not a huge amount and you won't see it that clearly on this, but in all honesty, if you were doing a whole lot of leaves, you would notice it. Even on this, I have to consider my tonal value. I'm really boring. So here is my little bit of a vein. If you are working with a directional light source, you will quickly learn that oftentimes, depending on the shape of what you are drawing, that is the lighter side and that is the darker side because of the shape. There's nothing to beat working with a directional light source and working from life. But it's not always practical, particularly in the winter. I am quite aware of that. Obviously, this little bit down here doesn't need to be overly emphasized, but it does need to be there. And you can see just these few strokes have made a difference. I've deliberately, again, because of the tone, left that little bit of lightness on the edge just to separate out tones, level of tones, because it allows an extra squeak of detail, which is very pleasing. And it's a subtle thing, but it's there. Suddenly that all works together. I'll define my edge, and that will be sufficient. I might need to just darken in here a little more, and even that. Some bits of dark can run together if they're not too important to the overall visual effect. Remember, this is not a pure botanical work. It's a decorative work done in a botanical style. Looking at that now, I can actually see I want just a little bit more dark down there. Now, it's up to you entirely whether you want to cast a shadow from that. I don't personally think it's necessary because I don't have very clear cast shadows from that petal. So it's got to be consistent throughout. this little bit needs to be done, and then we need to talk about the rest of those depth of field techniques. Right, let's just put a simple little bit of shadow underneath there, because that's a completely different shape. So we don't need too much. It's catching the light quite a bit because of where it is, the shape of it. I'll just crisp up the edge. Foreground things always need a nice crisp edge, and that is quite fine at this stage. Any other further details, often these have little spiky bits. We'll get onto those later, but we got to get the overall structure done first. All right, now these two, whenever you are doing something with perspective and depth of field, you need to do your foreground one first, and it needs to be completed. Because of the fact with colored pencil, it's quite difficult to balance out. If you do a pale background one, how much more can you put on the foreground to achieve depth of field? It's far easier to work the foreground first and recede as you go backwards, because you can actually see it happening. So when you apply the color, the local color, we do the same thing to begin with. When you apply the local color onto those two, you need to apply it a little more gently than what you did your foreground one, and you need to be able to see that. So I'm starting with my light green as per usual, and I am applying my light green. I'm being aware that I need to apply it just a little more gently, and I also need to be aware that this is all crissy-crossying again. It's twisting. So here is my row, my tram lines, to separate things out. They're slightly large and exaggerated. They will reduce as I go along, just as I did there where I've got my tram lines. So I'm going to just lay in my green quite gently, my lightest green, quite gently. Let me just zoom through that. I'm going quite fast just so that you don't have to stare at this for too long, because then I want to show you how you're going to lay in the green over there. Right, and here we've got the little sort of tram lines happening again. It's this leading edge. It's the edge that's closest to your eye the whole way through. You're thinking from a perspective point of view. Often what helps is if you actually think of the plant as if you're looking at it from the top. That can be quite a helpful technique when you're considering perspective. Right, this is quite thick. I think I need to see if I can erase some of that and narrow it down. Has left a little mark on the paper, but I think I'll probably be able to get rid of it or get away with it. So that's my lightest green laid in. Now, before I go on to the darkest green, I need to do exactly the same on this one, except I need to lay it in more gently still. I can make that a little broader. So I'm now going to lay in my lightest green, but I want it gently. Now I am achieving, or I'm going to be attempting to achieve, on this artwork 3 levels of tone of perspective: foreground, midground, background. With practice, you can actually achieve up to 5 and 6 levels, and it's a very, very effective technique, as I said, when you are doing a lot of leaves, because it separates out the leaves and makes your finished artwork a whole lot more interesting. Now, quite difficult to see the difference. It will work, that's fine at this stage. If you find it very difficult to lay in the pencil gently enough, what can be of great help is a kneadable eraser, and you simply lift some out. That can be very effective on a tip where you want the tip shown, but you do not want that tip leaping out at you because it takes away the eye from the focal point. Now I'm going to go in with the dark green and again lay it in more gently. So I'm still thinking tonally, but I'm just laying it in with a little more care. Very, very carefully. I can darken if I want to. Because this is a slightly different technique to how we have done the rest. So your perspective, your depth of field technique is different to how we have actually done the rest of the laying in. With practice, you can choose a number of different ways of doing a depth of field technique. But it's worthwhile just considering this one to begin with. So my darker green, that I think, would it have caught a little bit more light? Possibly. So let's just lift a little of that out and just emphasize my lighter green slightly. But there will be darker green at the bottom here. And next to my light of my foreground, I want to make sure I have a little bit of a definite dark, because again, it's the contrast, light and dark. So the whole time you are thinking light and dark. Color, whilst important, is secondary. In my opinion, tone is what gives you shape and form. Right, let's just have a look at that. That's looking fine. This part here can be a little shadowed as well. I'm working in quite delicately. If you stop the video and go back, you will notice that I was able to put them with a bit more oomph there. Here I'm being quite measured with the amount of tone I put in. You will see why just now. Now I have to think about that little curly twirly bit. It's flattened out now, and so I'm just thinking, where would my shadow be? It would be on that side. The bottom here might have a little bit of shadow, but that might be catching the light. So I'm keeping it quite simple. Again, you can immediately see how the dark is giving you shaping. This could be fractionally darker. Now I need to do that one at the same time. I must be able to compare my midground to my background. In my opinion, you are welcome to find another way to do it, but I find I need to be able to do it this way. I need to be able to visually compare the two so that my background recedes. And when you are doing the background ones, you still want the same level of accuracy, but obviously because the application of pencil is much lighter, you're not going to be able to visually see the same amount of detail. So just think about that statement for a moment. You still want the same level of accuracy, but because the application is that much lighter, it's automatic that the level of detail is less. And you can see what I'm saying. It's this, I'm putting the same level of detail in, and yet I can see more what's happening here. Okay, so now before we do any burnishing and or adding anything else, you just want to refine. That line there is a little bit dark. I'm not necessarily going to take it out. I'm just going to work from the outer edge inwards, just to soften that line a bit. Whole time I'm comparing, visually comparing the two. I'm just going to define this edge a little. Notice I'm working now with the lighter green again. As I get to the top here, I'm deliberately leaving that very soft. That looks fine. Let me just look at this and see if there's any areas that need refining. You will understand in a minute why I'm doing my refining now. If you happened to have slightly fuzzy edges on your background petal or leaf or sepal, it doesn't matter, because in the background you don't need the crispness that you need in the foreground. Let's just have a look at that now and see. Now, here comes the different technique. I am now going to add my tonal tool. Remember, all the rest of this, I added my tonal tool after the burnish. For this technique, I am going to add my tonal tool now, but with a great deal of tact. So very gently, I'm going in with a Payne's grey in the shadow areas, in the darkest shadow areas, very gently. I'm really just tickling the paper. I don't want to press too hard, but I do need the level of tonal value to still be accurate. Just a tickle here. It needs to be just a smidgen darker, and I need a little bit more down here as well. So with this technique, what you need to do is you actually need to almost complete it before the burnish. Here as well, tiny little bit more tonal value, just a tickle, even more of a tickle. Little smidgen at the lower end. I've noticed that that part is too light. So I'm just going to go in, not with the actual tonal tool, I don't think it needs darkening down that much, but just with the darker green and a very delicate touch. And I'm just going to darken it slightly. It's all about control when you're doing this technique. That as well could be just slightly darkened down. Okay, so now we're going to do something a bit different. We have done everything. We've laid in the basic color. We have gone in with our tonal tool. Remember, the technique is different. Now we're going to burnish, and if we've done all this part correctly and accurately, we should not need to go back. So when you're doing depth of field, I find the best is to, after a burnish, you leave it. Okay, I'm going to burnish the foreground, my midground one, with white. Now I must burnish quite carefully because this should be my final layer. Remember, with the foreground, you went back again and put an extra layer on. So you could sort of tweak up any errors that weren't too good. Here, the burnish should actually be the last thing you do. Obviously, that's not set in stone. If you needed to go and add a little extra tweak, you can. Remember, it's your artwork. You can do what you like. But you'll see what I mean, how that milkiness, let me just go up that edge. I don't mind that edge not being that well defined. That's not a problem at all. You can see how the milkiness that has been created by the burnish helps you to push this sepal into the background. And it's as simple as that. It just works. This background one, I'm going to almost put two little burnishes on, quite gently. I am now going to burnish that gently with Cold Grey 1. Cold Grey 1, exactly as the name implies, has a little blue in it. Remember, we used ivory in the foreground to pop it forward. White in the midground because it's quite neutral. A little bit of something with blue in it will push that back. However, you don't want to press too hard because you don't want to darken it. But if I just put a gentle layer of something with a little bit of blue in it, it again visually makes it a bit different to that one. So just a smidgen. I'm not pressing very hard with that burnish. Up to the top there. Then to take away any of the texture, I will put an extra little bit of white over it. And again, how you do it is a balancing act between the effect you are creating. Looking at that now, I think that is looking fine. What I might do, because this lower part is not too far away from the actual plant, I've got to think things through. I'm going to just put a tickle of extra green on the lower part. I might even put a little bit of Payne's grey, but I'm not going up the whole way. I'm just strengthening part of it. I don't want anything to compete with that is my foreground. Just a little smidgen. I'm not going all the way up. I'll just put a little more light green here. And a little more light green on the edge there, but quite delicately. Here you can see a bit of clumping that has occurred. Remember, I did say green clumps. It's just one of those things. Just live with it. I'll just tickle a small amount more shadow in there. Very delicately. There are areas when you're working with coloured pencil that you press hard, and there are other areas when you work with coloured pencil that you're very, very delicate in the application. I think that now looks better. And I don't think I need to do a whole lot more to it. If we have a look at that now, you can see a complete difference between your foreground sepal, your midground sepal, and your background sepal. And the fact that that is so pale and basically indistinct, it is there, but it does not compete with the bud, which is the focal point. And that is a very useful technique. Well, I find it very useful. I hope you do too. I would consider that this Rosebud is now complete. It shows good depth of field, which adds interest. It shows a lovely focal point. Remember, it is a decorative work of art as opposed to being true botanical, and yet it's been completed in quite a botanical style. If you found this interesting and inspiring, perhaps you'd like to have a look at more videos on the old Kennels website. Thanks for watching.